All right, we have asked, and we trust the Lord for His for the time tonight, this evening, to be maximized. There's an enormous amount to share. I've been living in Israel for a quarter of a century. Doesn't that make me sound really old? And mostly I've been focusing in all of this time. Thank you. Mostly I have my focus, my attention has been primarily drawn and focused in on the struggle over the land of Israel. From the beginning, when I went there in 1991, just very briefly to kind of give a bit of a personal background, I joined the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem as a reporter. I came out of a political reporting position in South Africa, and was led to the embassy to cover the geopolitical events that are at the center of international focus on the land of Israel, but for a Christian readership. The reality being that this conflict, which has lasted for so many decades, and has had so much political capital expended on it in an effort to bring peace and a solution to the Middle East, that has the second largest foreign press corps in the world. After Washington, D.C., there's no place on earth where there are more foreign journalists than in Jerusalem, and yet this tiny little scrap of a country obsesses the world. And it obsesses Christians too, because whether we have an understanding of it or not, we have a gut response to Israel. I'm talking about evangelical, I'm talking about Bible-believing Christians. We feel an affinity with that nation. Obviously, out of that nation, we have everything that is near and dear to us. And yet, most Christians were getting their news from CNN and Fox News and the BBC and Sky and all these other secular news organizations. Some of them are horrible. Some of them are just blatantly anti-Semitic. Others are more perhaps subtly so, and others aren't anti-Semitic necessarily, but they are purely secular, and they cannot communicate to Christians the biblical framework in which these events are unfolding. That not only have given rise to untold reams of newspaper coverage and media coverage, but actually have biblically speaking, a definitive impact, and will have a definitive impact on the future of all of us, on our countries, on what lies ahead for all of us in our different nations. This, the vital need to understand how the connection between our countries and Israel impacts on the future of what God is doing, but most immediately on the future of our nations, is something that cannot and will not be communicated, obviously, through the secular press. So, going to Israel to cover this part of that reality, my first assignment was to Madrid to cover the International Middle East Peace Conference that was called by George Herbert Walker Bush, Secretary of State James Baker, when Israel and the Arab states and the once removed cousins of the Palestine Liberation Organization were called together as the world began to grapple with the problem of the land of Israel and how to divvy up this land and hand it out in such a way that it would secure, compromise, some kind of lead up to some kind of a peace. Madrid didn't actually result in anything directly in and of itself, but a year and a half later, the world heard that secret meetings had been taking place up in Norway, in Oslo, and the next thing we knew, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was on the White House lawn together with Yasser Arafat and Bill Clinton, pushing the two men together to shake hands to sign this agreement, the Oslo Accords, which would then really tip us into a chute that has grown increasingly narrow and dangerous and steep, and has propelled Israel and propelled us in Israel towards a situation that cannot but be cataclysmic, that cannot but be extremely violent and explosive. That's just the journey we've traveled on for the last 25 years. It comes to a head very recently, not to a final expression, but to a head very recently when Joseph Biden, just a few days ago, just a few days ago, he spoke to he spoke to a Jewish organization here called J Street. In fact, both him and Secretary of State John Kerry were sent there by President Obama, and they stood in front of the audience, primarily or overwhelmingly Jewish audience, and then the statement that comes from Joseph Biden when he says, I'm sorry, but the internet just kicked me off, so I'm just quickly finding it again. I want to get his exact words. When he said that the United States is extremely frustrated with Israel, with the Israeli government. John Kerry, just a couple of days earlier in Geneva, had stated that the United States knows what's best for Israel. That's how blatantly he said it, actually. He said, we know what the answer is that Israel needs, and we know that they know it, that the two-state solution is the only way forward. And so John Kerry called for an international coordination among states, international states, to come together to help nudge Israel down the only road that apparently the world believes Israel should go down. The basics of this battleground, the front line of the battle, which is the land of Israel, I'm assuming that all of you in this room know about. I don't think I need to do a geographical, historical timeline on a map, or series of maps. Do I need to do that? Would it be helpful if I went over that at all? Not necessary. Save time. We know the basics. We know that. Well, let me take a quick step into another section and then come back here, because this kind of helps focus us in on the timeline in which we're actually living, and that is a series of amazing anniversaries are going to take place next year. 2017, the Gregorian calendar year, there are going to be some very important events being commemorated. All of them tied to the land of Israel and the Jewish people's return to that land.
Wow.
All right, let's go with it. It starts like this. 500 years ago, a man called Martin Luther unlocked the Bible. He took it off the pulpit, threw away the chain, reproduced it from Latin into the vernacular, and handed it out to everybody and said, you can read the Bible. The Bible was freed up after nearly 1,500 years, after 1,500 years of being basically restricted to priests and church officials in Latin, communicating the Word of God to people, and with their largely replacement theology position, because it was Catholic dogma that the Jewish people had been driven from the land because they had killed Christ, and they were going to wander the world until they accepted Jesus, and then they would come back to their land. They've obviously had to rewrite that in the recent history. But the Bible wasn't freely available. And the Bible, as we all know, is all about Israel. Except for the first few pages of the Bible, everything else in here is about Israel. And whereas our tendency is to see the church at the center of everything, the church is only mentioned 120 times in this book, whereas Israel is mentioned 3,770 times. It's all about Israel, it's all about that land, it's all about that nation. That's what the Bible is all about. That wasn't widely preached in the first 1,500 years of Christendom. But what Martin Luther did 500 years ago was the one big good thing that he did, and of course he made some terrible mistakes, but it was that he made the Bible freely available. And it basically opened up this message, which didn't take hold instantly. It took a little while, it took a couple of centuries to begin to work into the Protestant church, until Charles Haddon Spurgeon stood up in the pulpit and said, we cannot ignore the fact that God is going to bring the Jews back to their land, and what's more, we need to participate in this. This is something that the body of Christ should be doing, bringing them back to their land. And the whole history of restorationism, which we call Christian Zionism, really has its origins in the freeing up of the Bible and making it available for everybody. Now, that's 500 years ago. In the same year that Martin Luther nailed his theses to the door of the chapel in Wittenberg, the Ottoman Turkish Empire swallowed up the land of Israel. And it became part of the Turkish Empire, and it would remain so for the next 400 years. 400 years plus 200 years of previous to that of Arab control of the land. For 600 years the land was under Islamic control. In late 1892, Jewish people began coming back to the land. They came back to the land in waves of immigration. that would unfold over the ensuing decades up until World War II. And the first part of their return to the land, they were coming to an Islamic country. But then, 100 years ago, next year, soldiers who came from the farthest ends of the earth, in Winston Churchill's words, nobody even really understood the deeper meaning of their participation in this conflict. As volunteers from Australia and New Zealand came to participate in World War II, and after suffering horrific defeat at Gallipoli, 2 years later, they were the spearhead that pierced the wall of Islam when the 800 light horsemen of the Anzac charged across the sands of Beersheba with bayonets in their hands straight into the machine gun nests of the Turks, who were so taken by surprise that they couldn't even realign their guns, and so they were shooting over the heads of the soldiers, and they conquered Beersheba. And obviously they were part of the great force of the British, of the Allied forces, the British and the French. This is the British Empire. But it was very specifically, and particularly, these Australian and New Zealanders who were at the point of the spear that would eventually push the Muslims out of the land of Israel. 3 months later, of course, Jerusalem was liberated as General Allenby marched in, and the land was liberated. So we're going to have the 500th anniversary of the Reformation next year. We're going to have the 100th anniversary of the charge of the Australian Light Horse. On the same day, on the very same day that they captured Beersheba, in London, a document was drafted. It was called the Balfour Declaration. And the 100th anniversary of the drafting of the Balfour Declaration takes place also next year, in which His Majesty's government supports and looks favorably upon the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It's simply a letter of intent, that's all it is. It's not a legal document, but a few years later at San Remo in Italy, it will be ratified and into international law by the League of Nations. International law that, by the way, doesn't matter how many people say that the emperor is wearing very nice clothes, he's actually stark naked. Doesn't matter how many people say that Jewish settlements in Judea and Samaria are illegal, they're not illegal. Right. International law, as upheld by the charter, the founding charter of the United Nations, stipulates Judea and Samaria set apart for close Jewish settlement. Wow. The Arabs in Judea and Samaria are the illegal occupiers. Yeah. And that whole story as it unfolds. Don't ask anybody in the world to stand on this one, except for Julie Bishop, the Foreign Minister of Australia, who 2.5 years ago in Jerusalem said, "Show me where it's written that Jewish settlements are illegal under international law." Everybody states it as fact that it is, but it's not. It's simply not. A little bit more about that in a few moments. So we will celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration next year. We will also celebrate the 70th anniversary of the General Assembly resolution to partition Palestine. All right, the 29th of November 1947, the General Assembly of the United Nations voted to partition Palestine between Jew and Arab. It's important to note that the General Assembly cannot pass laws, and that Israel's validity, Israel's legitimacy is not in any way, shape or form based on that resolution. It has no substance. It doesn't. There's much stronger substance behind it. But nonetheless, it was the decision that had Jews dancing in the streets of Jerusalem, Golda Meir choked up with tears, David Ben-Gurion walking round and round, pacing round and round as he knew the next morning there would be war. And Israel comes back to life, in fact. It's as if the dead corpse of Israel, the gathered together bones of Israel, if you like, although this isn't the proper analogy, but nonetheless, begins to be resuscitated then. The very day after the United Nations votes to partition Palestine, it begins to discuss how to reverse that partition. That's something that's also not so widely known. The international pressure, not least of all instigated by, I think, George C. Marshall was his name, the Secretary of State that year, to change the vote outcome, because, well, for whatever reason. Nonetheless, the United Nations began to try and reverse the process. And then, of course, a few months later, David Ben-Gurion would cast the deciding vote on a Friday afternoon in Tel Aviv that would bring Israel back to life. And Israel isn't born in 1948, Israel is resurrected in 1948. The nation comes back to life then. It has been around for a lot longer than just 70 or so years. All right, so there's another anniversary taking place next year. More excitingly, next year is the 50th anniversary of the return of the Jewish people to Judea and Samaria. It's the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War, which also means it's the 50th anniversary, the Jubilee year, in terms of our calendars at least, the Jubilee year of Israel's return to Jerusalem and the liberation of Jerusalem. So all of these events are taking place next year. They're all tied specifically and directly to the land of Israel, to the return of the Jewish people to that land, to the miraculous victories of the War of Independence that gave Israel their land, to the miraculous Six-Day War that the whole world was agog about when Israel pushed the Egyptians and the Syrians back and expanded the control over the land. They returned to Jerusalem. All of this will be celebrated in one form or another next year. A very exciting celebration will be a reenactment of the Charge of the Light Brigade, as Australians and New Zealanders are coming. And I have the honour of being one of the guides on one of their buses. So I'm not sure I'll get onto a horse, but I already have the hat. So I'm working on it. All right. So that's kind of on the plus side. In fact, it's all actually plus, but it has some minuses along the way, apparent minuses. The world is determined to steal the patrimony of the Jewish people, to rob them of their land, and to give it to people who not only have no historical national right to it, but who in fact publicly and openly declare that they will use it to destroy what's left of Israel. Something which, and now I'm going to speak to you as Americans, and I'm going to speak about your officials. I'm not an American. I think I'm in a fairly safe environment to do this, I hope so. But most of the rest of what I say this evening will be pertinent to your country as you're in this election year. Which is a Judeo-Christian country,
right. Yes.
Which was founded by a divine decision, as men and women came across the oceans, among other things, to establish an entity where the gospel would be propagated. This was a part of course, the Mayflower Compact, which our bloodline has a signatory tie to. And I understand and I appreciate that there are aspects of the settlement of North America and the ramifications of that on the peoples that were in the land that are part of the bigger picture that I am not up to speed on in every sense, in every way. But what I believe passionately is that God chose to establish the United States of America as a nation that would be based on the Word of God and that would have a purpose of propagating the gospel. As a Judeo-Christian country, one would then think that perhaps because we got everything that is nearest and dearest to us from the Jewish people, we would be able to make bold statements like Marco Rubio made when he was asked a few weeks ago, as President of the United States, what would your position be on Israel? How would you stand vis-a-vis the Israeli-Arab conflict? And he said, without batting an eyelid, without hesitating, he said, I would be completely pro-Israel. That's what he said, okay? I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a little while. The fact is, of course, that this Judeo-Christian country has become dangerous to Israel. It has dealt with Israel in a way that is threatening the existence of that country. It's a process that began. Now, one of the areas that I've most often been chastised in by my American readers over the years is, please differentiate between those folks in Washington and the rest of us. Don't just talk about America. As a journalist writing about politics, we always talk about the nation. Okay, we mean obviously the leaders of the nation, but we're talking about the nation. That's just what we do. But I do understand, and Israelis, by the way, understand that in the United States there are multitudes and multitudes of people that love Israel. They understand that. And they also understand that it isn't always the case that everybody on Capitol Hill is against Israel. In fact, there is an awareness that there's this balance of power, that if you don't have a friend in the White House, you certainly have friends on the Hill. This is something that Israelis do understand, and it's part of the bigger picture. At the end of the day, however, and this is all in the news right now, but at the end of the day, the United States is participating officially at a governmental level, and this has been both Republican and Democrat, is assisting in the manufacture of 2 weapons of mass destruction against Israel. Weapon number 1, the Iranian nuclear weapon. Whether or not, I might sound a little bit opinionated here, but I'm expressing also the way this is read over the sea in Israel. Whether or not they have, the leaders of this land have access to all the necessary intelligence information and background, I don't know. I would assume that they do have. I would assume that they would understand that there is some risk, at least. Let's err on the side of caution, that there is at least some chance, maybe even a small chance, that the Iranians, if they were given the opportunity, would race to acquire a nuclear weapon. Maybe even a 3% chance that they would race for that weapon. That's 3% too much of a chance, from Israel's point of view. And it's outrageous, actually, if you think that a Judeo-Christian country would maybe, just maybe, hoping that through their diplomatic skills and negotiation process, forget about all the intrigue that's behind it, the relationship that John Kerry has personally with people in the Iranian government, and all that other conspiratorial stuff, forget about that for a moment. But just that this country, supported of course by England and France and all, virtually every other country on earth, that this country would be willing to even risk a small chance of Israel's annihilation, just a few years after one out of every 3 Jews on the planet were killed. That's a reality. And the other weapon of mass destruction, or the other existential weapon that's been formed against Israel, is a state called Palestine. And it is the determined effort of the administrations, plural, of the United States of America. It's been the determined effort of these administrations to bring about the creation of the state. Do I have to go here into, let's just leave for a moment, let's just leave God's promising of the land to the Jewish people, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Let's leave that on the side if we dare for just a moment. Do I need to go into some background information here as to why the creation of Palestine would be existentially threatening to Israel, or are you all aware of this? Is this already something that you understand? You know that this is the high ground. You know that Israel, 80% of the Israeli population is wedged in a 9-mile wide zone between that high ground and the sea, and most of our industry base is in that little area. You do know that when Israel has relinquished control over territory, whether it was southern Lebanon in 2000 or the Gaza Strip in 2005, that the Arabs, given free access to those territories, instead of using those areas to begin to build a peaceful coexistence with Israel, turned them into launching rocket pads and began launching rockets at Israel. Both the thousands of rockets that have come from Gaza and the mass attack from southern Lebanon and from the Hezbollah in 2006, the Second Lebanon War. This didn't come as any surprise. It didn't come out of the blue. Up until now, today, we know, Israeli intelligence knows, your intelligence knows, that the Hezbollah have been positioning 100,000 plus rockets along the southern end of Lebanon, in houses, in villages, in towns, facing Israel, that can reach any target in Israel. At any moment, a word from Tehran to the Hezbollah, which is a proxy army for the Iranians, launch your missiles. And Israel faces something that is much, much bigger than the Second Lebanon War of 2005. The Palestinian Arab leadership is on the record for decades already, as saying, they're on the record, both in terms of what they say publicly, both in terms of what they publish in their school books and teach their children, the maps they show of the Middle East. Everything they say, publicly and openly among their own people, is that the state of Palestine will give them what they need to finally push the Jews into the sea. Hitler spoke, long before he became Chancellor, he spoke about his intention to annihilate the Jewish people. There were politicians in Great Britain that wanted to invite him over and host him at Westminster when he came to power in Germany, thinking they could form some kind of détente, some kind of relationship with the new Germany. Ahmadinejad and Khamenei in Iran have expressed openly, Israel will be no more, Israel's days are over. pursuing nuclear weapons, expending billions of dollars, which they apparently don't even have, on developing this very complex nuclear development program, deep underground, under mountains in different parts of the country. They say what they're going to do, they say what they intend to do, and still the West does business with them, running to make money, finding a way to drop the sanctions so that people can go and make money, businesses can go and make money. So this is not an unknown, it's not a surprise. And it will be no surprise. It will be no surprise, not to Jimmy Carter, not to George Bush Sr., not to Bill Clinton, not to Barack Obama, not to George Bush Jr., not to any president. It will be no surprise if the state of Palestine, which they are pushing Israel to have, is used as an attack pad against Israel. No surprise. And they will not be able to stand before anybody, not least alone before God, and say, well, we didn't know. They know. There's no glimmer of hope down the diplomatic path towards peace that it can bring peace. 25 years, all kinds of methods have been attempted and tried. Okay, so I think I've probably conveyed quite strongly my sense that the battle for the land, insofar as the world is concerned, is something that is almost draining international resources as people try to come up with some kind of a solution. And of course, this while the big players are at work repositioning in the Middle East. Vladimir Putin is now getting a good foothold there. He has successfully, and I don't know how you feel about this, I imagine how you might feel about this, but compared to your president, he's a leader that's made decisions and he's doing them. And the Obama administration has shown nothing in the way of strength to hold him back. And what has he achieved now? What he's achieved a trio of nations, an alliance of nations around our northern and northeastern border. Lebanon, which is basically Hezbollah. Syria, which is still under Assad, and is an ally of the Iranians, who now have no more sanctions and are able to pursue their whole program. The Russians handing and sending, the Russians sending anti-aircraft missiles, now busy doing that now to Tehran, so that the Iranians can protect their nuclear weapons against an IAF strike. It's a wall-to-wall alliance of enemies to the northeast of us, and that's thanks to, as we see it, the very weak foreign policies of the current administration. That's what it's led to for us over there. So there is this massive battle going on for the land. On the 30th of May this year, France is holding a summit in Paris. They have invited the leaders, the foreign ministers of 20 nations to come together. They want to plan an event later in the year that will be an international conference where Israel and the Arabs will be invited, so that the international community can do what John Kerry said in Geneva on May the 1st, that the international community together will come and form an alliance to basically push Israel to take this step. Okay, so now on the one hand, you've got all these anniversaries taking place of the Jews returning to their land, of God's promises of bringing them back to their land, of Him planting them there, of them getting more and more victories, getting more and more of the land back. This is all happening next year, and we have this massive international momentum towards forcing Israel out of half of that land and into a situation which potentially they could be driven out of the rest of the land. It's basically almost as black and white as that. This coming to a head of these forces, really, of the Word of God and the fulfillment of the Word of God on the one hand, and the international community's efforts to reverse this process that's happening. Now, I opened my Bible. It was really a few years ago when I first came over to the United States, that a lady, a dear grandmother who had followed and become friends with me over the years through my writings in Jerusalem, she attended one of my meetings, and afterwards she came up to me and she chastised me and she wagged her finger under my nose, and she stood that high. And she said, don't you ever get up in front of people and talk about what God is doing in Israel without reading from His Word. Because what God says in His Word is actually all we have to hear, and everything that you say, Stan, good enough, is simply commentary. And of course she's right. God's Word is all we really need. Do you know how many times in the first 5 books of the Bible God uses the term or the phrase, the land I have given you, the land I will give you, the land I am giving you? the land I have given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, etc., etc. Any guesses here? In the first 5 books of the Bible, how many times does God use that phrase or variation of that phrase?
300.
Oh, okay, no, you guys are pushing it. No, 60 times. Okay. But that's simply one sentence. Over and over and over and over and over again, as if God is trying to make sure that he doesn't forget it one day. He says it over and over again. This is a decision I have made. I've given this land to you. I've given this land to you, Abraham. It's confirmed in covenant through Isaac away from Ishmael and through Jacob away from Esau. And that is the line exclusively and forever that the land is given to that nation. And God makes sure that now in the end of days, when the whole world is arguing about who has ownership of that land, that those of us who believe the Bible don't have a question about it. Doesn't matter how much the Palestinians are suffering. It doesn't matter how much the this or the that or what we hear in the news. God has given that land to the people of Israel. Only and forever to them. I will address the elephant in the room. I will speak about the Palestinian Arabs in a little while, but I'll get there. What I want to quickly point us to, and then I'll take this further. When Jesus was in my homeland, not the land I now call home, when Jesus was there, and as he moved among people, he often referred to the statements that had been made by Moses and all the prophets. You remember that phrase? As Moses and the prophets have said. Moses and all the prophets have confirmed this. Moses was the greatest prophet in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible. As he brought the people of Israel through the wilderness and he brought them to the borders of the land that they would conquer, he foretold them their future. He spelled it out very, very in great detail. The passages that focus on that are in Leviticus chapter 26 and in Deuteronomy. The exact reference I'll give you in a little bit. The two passages that basically the one is a repeat of the other, where Moses warns the people. First of all, he promises the people, once you get into the land, if you obey God, if you're faithful to the Lord, then then all these blessings will come to you. You will become the number one superpower of the world. You'll become the head of the nations. You will enjoy prosperity. You will have rainfall. Your families will grow. You will live in good health. On and on and on he goes with all the promises of blessings if they are faithful to him. But if you're unfaithful to me, then all these horrible curses will come upon you. Well, it was revelationary to me. It may not be this to you, but it was revelationary to me that this is a prophecy. It's actually a very detailed description of what will be for the people of Israel. And they will move right into the realization of that prophecy after they conquer the land in the first place. They'll come to God, they'll come to the land, and they will get a king, and God will establish them there, and then God will establish them as the number one superpower, as the head of the nations. At a time when all of the land of Israel will be under the sovereignty of the first son of David to sit on the throne, Solomon. He will have a mighty IDF, okay, these chariot army, his chariot forces. The temple of God will stand in the city of Jerusalem. The glory of God will be seen in the temple. World leaders, not just the Queen of Sheba, world leaders from all over the known world will come up to Jerusalem to hear the wisdom of Solomon, to see the glory of the temple. And every man will live under his vine and under his fig tree, and nobody will make them afraid. Peace will come to the Middle East. And it did. Probably the only time in history that there was peace there. And then Moses said, but the other things would happen, and they also happened. And the detail, and he didn't miss a thing. He tells everything that will happen to them. But at the end, of course, this mainly focuses in on judgment. First of all, God will chastise them. If they don't turn, he'll chastise them more. If they don't repent, he'll chastise them more, and eventually he'll expel them from the land. And then they'll wander. They'll wander around the face of the earth. There'll be no place to rest the soles of their feet. They'll be terrorized from morning to night and hated wherever they go. And that's the condition that they'll end up in if they're unfaithful to God. And this, of course, is also the history of the people of Israel. But then, at the end of this passage, Moses says, from verse 40, well, let's just pick up the last part of the curses. They shall stumble over one another as it were before a sword, where no one pursues them, and you shall have no power to stand before your enemies. You shall perish among the nations, and the land of your enemies shall eat you up. And those of you who are left shall waste away in their iniquity in your enemies' lands. Also in their fathers' iniquities, which are with them, they shall waste away. But if they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers, with their unfaithfulness in which they were unfaithful to me, and that they also have walked contrary to me, and that I also have walked contrary to them, and have brought them into the land of their enemies, if their uncircumcised hearts are humbled, and they accept their guilt, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham. I will remember the land. The land of Israel, as you know, I hope you know, the land of Israel is an integral part of the covenant relationship that God made with Abraham. It's a triangular covenant, really. It's God, Abraham, and his seed, and the land of Israel. Christianity has taken the land issue out and says that, mainly, and said the land issue is no longer important. I'm talking now about mainstream Christianity, which is that God is finished with Israel anyway. They rejected Christ, so they're no longer God's chosen people. We've replaced them. That's been mainstream Christendom's teachings through the centuries. Okay? But even among Christians that are aware that God is not finished with Israel, and that God has restored the people back to their ancient homeland, the whole issue of the battle for the land is something that is on the side for most of us. Barely any pro-Israel Christian works, churches, organizations are taking a proactive stand supporting Israel's right to actually extend sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. In 2017, at the anniversary of the Six-Day War, an international conference of jurors, of judges and lawyers is coming together in The Hague. And they are going to make Israel's case, or the case for Israel's right to extend sovereignty over Judea and Samaria based on international law. It's a conference that's being convened by Christians, but it's not a Christian event. At the same time, a man that's made a number of movies, including The Forsaken Promise, and if any of you have seen The Forsaken Promise, it's about the Balfour Declaration and Britain's betrayal of the Jews, and a number of other movies, an organization called Hatikva Films out of London. He set up a new business down in Australia, and he's making a film which he wants to release at the same time, which also looks at Israel's right legally to claim the land. So there is this effort is underway. But it's not supported widely by Christians at all. In fact, most Christians are not engaged in the battle for the land of Israel. Most Christians have abandoned that battlefield to the enemy. And he's focusing all his attention on it. Now we come to where your nation is at this point in history, as you have men running for the presidency, men and a woman. In light of where things have been up until now, where is this likely to go? The view from Israel at the moment is one of great uncertainty about who will be your new president. There's a general negative attitude about Hillary Clinton. She has been seen in the past to say one thing about Israel and then to do something else. Israelis, by and large, unless they're extreme left-wingers, they do not trust her. Donald Trump is a complete mystery for almost everybody. And
that's nice.
And well, I'm going to share something with you that may make you rethink that in just a moment. All right. And of course, these are apparently the contenders. These two. I mean, there's still the email situation, so we don't know if Mr. Sanders still has an opportunity to make any headway. We're not sure yet whether you know the situation better than me. I don't have to unpack it for you, okay? But we're not sure. You're not sure, and we're not sure where this is all going. So I want to quickly share with you something that has been taking place in some Christian circles in Jerusalem for the last 4 years. And this is not a prediction. I'm not making any predictions tonight, not here. The only prediction I will make is that the Jewish people are safe in their land.
Thank you, Lord.
They are safe in their land. And I'll explain why I say that. But 4 years ago, when the current president was running for re-election, a Bible-believing veteran Christian Zionist who's lived in Israel for 50 plus years was in prayer, as he spends a lot of time in prayer, and we work closely together. And he told me, he said that he went to the Lord and prayed wondering how to pray for America. Now, this man carries a very big burden for your country. As a European, he believes that he and Europe is indebted to America because of the sacrifices of American boys that drove Hitler out of Europe and basically defeated the Nazis. And he has spent a lot of time traveling in the United States as well as in other parts of the world. Well, he went to the Lord to ask for direction, how to pray for the United States. And he felt the Lord took him to a passage in the Bible that deals with another man who was also very concerned about the future of his country. And that was Elijah the prophet. After Elijah had seen God's power on Mount Carmel demonstrated and had slain the prophets of Baal and Asherah, Jezebel threatened to kill him. And he ran away and hid in the desert. God went looking for him. God said to him, "Why are you here, Elijah?" He said, he said, "You can kill me, God, I'm done, let me die. My country's gone to the dogs. Everybody's bowing the knee to Baal, I'm the only one left who hasn't done so." God says to him, "Elijah, stand on your feet. I want to show you my glory." And he stands on his feet, and God's power is manifest, except that God's not in it. We have a thunderstorm, we have fire, we have hailstones, we have an earthquake. God is not in any of those. And then God manifests. And how does he manifest? In the still small voice. Okay, now those of you who know the answer to this question, please don't answer. What does the still small voice say to Elijah? The homily often given from pulpits in Christian churches is, the still small voice of God. We need to listen to his voice. It'll be gentle and sweet and peaceful and tell us that we should go and do this, that, or the other thing. Okay, but actually, in this sense, in this instance, the still small voice tells Elijah, "Go and anoint men to kill." Go and anoint men to kill. Go anoint 3 men. Anoint Hazael to be king of Assyria. Anoint Jehu to be king of Israel, the northern kingdom, and anoint Elisha to be your successor. And then he said, "And don't worry, Elijah, there are 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal." And that was enough for God. He didn't need like 1.5 million Israelites to be faithful. He just needed a handful of men and women who had not fallen into apostasy. That was enough for God. That's the way he works. As a word of encouragement to those of you who in this country are feeling that things have gone too far. And I've heard Christians on the West Coast and on the East Coast in the last 10 days, individuals expressing despair and resignation that things are over for this country, that even if Hillary Clinton gets to power, that's it, they're going to leave the country. Somebody told me that today. Okay? There's no need to despair. There's no need to despair. There are people, more than 7,000 I believe, in this country who love the Lord with all their heart, mind and soul. And God can still use them, and I believe that he would want to use them, but that's my faith, that's my belief. When the prophet goes to anoint Hazael, he pours the oil on his head, and the prophet begins to cry. And Hazael says to him, "Why are you weeping?" He says, "I'm weeping because I'm anointing you to kill my people. I know what you're going to do to them." When he goes to anoint Jehu, he's given an instruction, anoint him and run out the room. And he does, he anoints Jehu and he runs. And that action causes Jehu to go and kill the king of Israel and to succeed him. And Jehu will go out as the new king of Israel, and he will totally do away with the Ahab-Jezebel administration. He'll wipe them both out, and he will kill all the children of Ahab. Right? And he will cleanse the land of the corruption brought about by that administration. I'm using that word purposefully. And so this man said to me, I believe that the Lord will raise up a Jehu for the United States.
Yes.
Jehu wasn't a nice man. He wasn't a particularly likable man. The decision to place that man in power was an act of mercy. It always is with God. He allowed bad things to happen to the northern kingdom in the hope that they would come to their senses and turn back to him. And so even though he said to Elijah, anoint men to kill, his motive was to turn the nation back to himself. And the 7,000 who didn't bow the knee to Baal obviously had a task to perform as well. Okay, so that's what this gentleman told me 4 years ago. 18 months later, he said to me, I know who to pray for. He says, I'm praying for Donald Trump to run for president of the United States. This is 2.5 years ago. A year ago, when I took a group of Americans around the country, first time they visited the land, they were on the Sea of Galilee, they were on Masada, they were in Jerusalem, they were living in the clouds, they were in Glory Land. And on the last day, we were up in Shiloh, and we had a little bit of time to spare before they went back to the airport. And I took them through Samaria. I said, why don't you come and meet this man? He'd like to talk to you. And so we stopped at his offices, and he spoke to them for about a half hour. And he said to them, right near the beginning of his presentation, he said, I'm praying for Donald Trump to run for president. And, you know, there was a bit of a snigger, and some people rolled their eyes, and some people said, oh, no, whatever. By the time he finished explaining, they were of one mind. As I took them down to Ben Gurion Airport, they said they understood how this man's thinking was led, as he believes by the Lord. While they were on their airplane flying back across the Atlantic, Donald Trump announced his candidacy. And from that day on, I've been watching, with that understanding, this man defy all the experts, all the forecasts, rubbish every argument being made by everybody who thinks they understand exactly why and how he will be defeated. And I have as much conviction as I have about anything, but I'm not saying this is the Lord hasn't said this to me. He said this to this man in a prayer time. But I'm just watching the fruit of this, or the direction. And it looks to me very much like a Jehu is being raised up for this country. And that's all I'm going to say about that. And I'm going to leave that with you just so you know that this is part of the picture out there. Okay. Whoever is president, the one issue that's going to bedevil his administration is the issue of Israel-Palestine. Of course, there is no Palestine. You know that. I have lots of fun with my groups when I take them around the country. After 3 or 4 days, they say, well, we've seen Israel, can we please see Palestine? I say to them, no, there's no such place. They say, well, of course there's such a place. No, there's no such place. Yeah, there's such a place. The United Nations has recognized Palestinians as a nation. You know, everybody talks about Israel, Palestine. Please, can we go see Palestine? I say, no, there's no such place. Because there isn't any such place. There was a place called Palestine, but of course that was part of the Turkish Empire. It was a province. It was an area in which there were Palestinian Jews and Palestinian Arabs. And the whole Palestinian nation cause that the world supports today is a fabricated thing. And if you have a good memory, you'll remember that the international community only became aware of the Palestinian Arab cause because the proponents of that cause wielded terrorism, used terrorism, hijacked airplanes, blew up restaurants in London and France, and drew the world's attention to the fact that the Palestinian Arabs had been robbed of their land and were living at the, you know, underneath the cruel Israelis, etc., 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 and the entire world today is on side with the Palestinian cause. I was sharing a little bit earlier that when I was down in Australia a few months back in Canberra, which is like their DC, their Washington DC, I had a chance to speak to some chiefs from the indigenous peoples' tribes, the so-called Aboriginal tribes in Australia. They had come together to present what they called a bark petition. They had inscribed on a piece of bark a petition against homosexual marriage. And they had come down there for that purpose. And I had an opportunity to talk to them for a few minutes about Israel. And I told them that the indigenous people of Israel are the Jewish people. And this was a new revelation to many of them, because they had been led to believe that the Palestinians were the indigenous people in Israel. But of course they are not, and there's plenty of documented proof of that. And it's not the propaganda statement I'm making; it's absolute fact. But the world is united, more or less united, behind the idea that Israel is occupying Arab lands, and that Israel needs to get out of those lands so that the Palestinians can have a state. I've gone into that already at some length tonight. At this point, I'm just going to pause, hit the brakes for a minute, because I want to hear where you people are at here. I want to ask you to throw me some questions, specific questions, and then I'm going to pick this up again in a few minutes. I have a couple other things I want to say. But about anything that I've spoken about up until this point, or any comments you'd like to make. Yes, sir.
Hopefully this is relative. Has there ever been a president in recent history, 52 on, that has been Israel friendly?
From Israel's point of view, in moments of crisis at least, primarily, well, Richard Nixon, of course, was the president who, in the midst of his Watergate scandal, ordered the largest ever airlift since World War II and saved Israel at the Yom Kippur War. So that's the debt that the Israelis haven't forgotten. Ronald Reagan was believed to be very pro-Israel. He allowed Arab propaganda to sway his emotions sometimes. He got angry with Israel on a number of occasions. But overall, he was seen as a good friend of Israel's. I struggled to... Oh, and Bill Clinton. President Bill Clinton visited Israel more than any other American president did. And he did so at a time when Israelis were being blown to bits all over the streets of the cities in the Second Intifada. He came time and time again. I remember when he arrived after a particularly difficult year. It was 2003, the month of March. We had a terror attack every day of the month. And he arrived in Jerusalem, and then he went down to Tel Aviv. And when he came into the concert hall where he was going to speak down there, the Israelis jumped to their feet and they said they welcomed him, Clinton, Clinton, ruler of the universe. That's how they welcomed him in Hebrew. They loved Bill Clinton. He was very emotive, expressed a lot of compassion. There's some people said at some point, you know, when he's finished with his next term, he can come and run for Prime Minister of Israel, etc., etc. At a certain level, he resonated with us, with Israel. Of course, he was a major pusher of the whole Oslo process. And if I can just take this one step further to clarify why it's a problem, and I'll point out two quick things: one that happened today and one that happened in 1998. In 1998, Israel celebrated the 3,000th anniversary of Jerusalem as the capital, as David declared his capital. And Al Gore was invited to be the guest speaker, the representative of your country, and he came over and he spoke at the Ramat, at the Hebrew University Stadium near the Knesset. I was there in the audience, and it was packed, and he stood in front of the crowd and he opened up his Bible. And he went to Ezekiel 37. And he read the vision of the dry bones. And then he read it very nicely, and then he closed the Bible and he said, I believe this is talking about you. Yeah, Al Gore said that. And then he proceeded to explain why they had to give their land away.
What?
The tactics of the enemy. 2 days ago, a Jew and a Muslim ran for the position of mayor of London. The Muslim won. Do you know what his first act was as mayor?
Oh, yes.
Did you read?
No.
Did you hear?
Today? No.
Mm-hmm. What did he do? He went to the Holocaust Memorial Museum to recognize the Holocaust. Yeah, to show respect.
Are you kidding me?
No, the enemy doesn't leave any stone unturned, and he knows exactly what he's doing. This was a genius stroke of his, of course, because Jews were very concerned, and others, Christians, were very concerned about a Muslim mayor of London, and what does that speak to? When he stood in that auditorium in Tel Aviv, Bill Clinton went with the passage in the Bible. Bill Clinton also liked to quote from the Bible. The two occasions that he quoted, or misquoted would be more accurate. Once was when he was down in the Jordan Valley and Israel signed the peace treaty with Jordan, 1994. And Bill Clinton stood up and he invoked the words of Jesus. Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall inherit the land. Oh, clap hands. But Jesus didn't say any such thing. What did Jesus say? Blessed are the peacemakers, because they shall be called sons of God. Nothing about the land, but Bill Clinton just put the two together. When he stood in the auditorium speaking to the Israelis in April 2003, he went to quote from the account of Balaam, who was called upon to curse the people of Israel. And he spoke to, now you know the story, Balak called Balaam to curse the people of Israel, and God wouldn't let him. Everything that came out of his mouth was a blessing. And one of the things that he blessed Israel with was he said, you will not be counted among the nations. You'll be different from all the other nations. This was a blessing. What Bill Clinton said that day was, don't worry, Israel, the day will come soon when you will be counted among the nations. As you'll become part of us, you'll become one of us. I mean, this is, of course, the insidious underlying thing, the whole heading, the whole movement towards a unified global government, one world order, etc. The new world order that led George Bush Sr. in the first place to call the people to Madrid to begin that first peace conference back in 1991. So does that partially answer your question? Short question, long answer. Yes, thank you. Any other points or questions about anything that I've said so far? Yes.
I asked you this yesterday, and I still am trying to internalize it. I don't understand why believers that we know who live in the land are for a two-state solution, and a lot of what we hear is the Palestinians really are suffering. And that's why we should be for a two-state solution. I'm not quite getting the connection. And my other question to you was, are the Palestinian believers, not just quote Christians, are they supporting us in the sovereignty of Israel over their land, or are they thinking that God is saying to them, you should have your own land?
The Palestinian Christians.
The Palestinian believers.
Palestinian believers.
Yeah.
Not the Israeli Arabs. Believers.
Oh, well, there's my ignorance.
Well, okay, it's an easy enough mistake to make. Look, the whole area was called Palestine before, right? All the people there were called Palestinians, Jews and Arabs. At the creation of Israel, the Jews started calling themselves Israelis. The Palestinian Arabs, some fled. Some were chased out by the IDF, some fled because they were encouraged to flee by their leaders. They went out of the land. They became the Palestinian Arab refugees, the Palestinian Arabs. But lots of Arabs stayed in the land. Same family, same Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, but they eventually would take Israeli identification, become citizens, and they are Israeli Arabs.
They're the ones.
Okay, so among those people, let me deal with the second part of your question first. We're talking about 1.6 million Arabs in Israel, citizens of Israel, of which about 3% are Christian. Most of those are Orthodox or East Orthodox Christians, either Greek or Catholic or Roman Catholic or Russian. And most of them are nominal. They're Christian by tradition. There's a tiny, tiny fraction who are Bible-believing, evangelical, however you want to put that. Among that fraction, most of those, including a couple of their pastors, they are very supportive of Israel's right to the land. But the rest of that segment, that 3% of Christian, Palestinian Christians, Israeli Arabs, Christians up until now, largely have been lumped together with the rest of the Arabs in Israel against the idea of the Jews being sovereign over all of the land. Now that has radically changed in the last 2 years. Follow along with me with this, because this is brand new. A Greek Orthodox Christian, a priest, Israeli Arab as he was designated, he began a movement to get the government to recognize Israel's Christians as not as Arabs. They had been lumped together with the Arab population. They spoke Arabic, they'd come out of the Arabic world, but actually their line, their bloodline, their heritage was back to the Aramaeans, to the ancient Aramaeans, who are no longer a people group, but their language was Aramaic, which is the language that Jesus spoke as well when he was here. And this priest began to gather around him others who believed the Bible and believed that this was their lineage and wanted to be seen as different. And he encouraged the young men to sign up and go to military service. Now, the 1.6 million Israeli Arabs are not mandated to do military service like the Jews are. Mainly because Israel won't force Muslims to go to war against fellow Muslims. They don't think it's humane, let alone anything else. Of course, I think there's a missed opportunity there, but I'm not going to go there right now. But the Aramaeans or the Christians have said we want a different designation on our Teudat Zehut, on our document. We want to be Aramaeans, and the Knesset took on to this and actually passed a law and has designated them now as Aramaeans. And the young men will serve 3 years in the army, and they'll be separate from the Israeli Arab population. And they're going to be loyal Israelis. I don't know what percentage is now yet fallen together with this man and his movement, but it's a growing movement. It's a new phenomenon. So yes, it is a little bit complex. You've got to sort of separate out the different groups. Overall, Israeli Arabs are strongly anti-Israel. Overall, Israeli Arabs are pro-Palestinian Arab. They are a fifth column in our midst. We understand that they wave the Palestinian flag rather than the Israeli flag, and all kinds of things are going on. And of course, it's not surprising. So that's the second question. Let's get back to the first question. Remind me.
Two-state.
Why they are in Israel supporters of a two-state solution in Israel?
Why they're
Among believers.
believing Jews.
Believing Jews in Israel, yes. What can I say about the believing Jews except that they're as fallible as the rest of us? It was already years and years ago that, I won't mention names, but that a couple that are today running a congregation, they were part of my congregation, a congregation I was fellowshipping at, and I heard them, and they remonstrated with me because I was taking the strong position against the Palestinian state. And they said, the Palestinians are suffering. They have the right to a homeland of their own. We've got some land, we can give them the land. There is, I don't know what proportion, what percentage, but there is, in the Messianic Jewish community in Israel, there is a percentage that want to go that way, that are motivated by compassion and concern, etc. And the only answer to them, not the only answer, but the primary answer to them is, but God has designated something different.
Yes.
God has ruled something should be different. And in terms of right to the land, in terms of historical rights to now, maybe the Jews can give some of their land away to the Palestinian Arabs. But the claim that this is Arab land that the Jews are occupying is simply untrue, in every way, shape and form. It was occupied by the Jordanians before the Six-Day War, and that was an illegal occupation under international law. They called it the West Bank. For 19 years it was called the West Bank, but for centuries it's been called Judea and Samaria. Okay? So they were driven out by the Israelis. The Israelis are now in that area. The Arabs in that area are not, it's not Arab lands that the Israelis are occupying. The Israelis have actually come back to their patrimony, to the cradle of their Jewish civilization. But there are people who are misguided. There are Christians, evangelical Christians. There is a conference that takes place in Bethlehem every other year. It's called Christ at the Checkpoint. It's evangelical. And they come together and they are so anti-Israel and so anti-Semitic that the Israeli government, the Interior Ministry, has actually issued instructions to the passport control officials at Ben Gurion Airport not to let them in. Because it says we're letting them in to come and actually call for our destruction. And now they've got traction.
Yes.
They've gained traction. They've grown in number and they've got support. And this is the evangelical Christian world. So there's great concern that the strongest pro-Israel group on earth, the evangelical Christians, are now being seduced away from support for Israel. And of course that is true. But the short answer to your question really is it's not surprising. They just they will not stand on the Bible. They will not stand on their own word of God. Or they will allow their hearts to be swayed by compassion. And a lot of that compassion, by the way, is stirred up with untruths or half-truths, with lies, actually, about how Israel treats the Palestinian Arabs so abhorrently and abuses human rights and everything else. I could give you anecdotal. I could give you some personal encounters we had. Just very briefly, there was a young woman who came to my home one day. She worked for YWAM. She said she'd been raised in a Christian home in America. She'd been raised to love Israel and the Jewish people. But when she joined YWAM, they put her in the base on the Mount of Olives. And she worked among the Palestinian Arabs for some months. And she came to me and she said, I've totally changed my position. She said, I've come to love the Arab people and I've come to hate Israel. And she was in a way, she was crying out for help. But the fact is, she said, I've heard what the Jews do to the Arabs. Well, you can hear lots of things. Yeah. And there's a lot of stuff out there. So there's a lot of deception. Yeah, any other quick questions? Yes,
Were you able to talk to her?
Yes, my wife and I talked to her, but she... well, we didn't meet her again after that, so I don't know what we said took root, but I could give her hard and fast examples of lies that had been reported as fact and then subsequently been shown to be lies. Lots and lots of them have happened over the years. Yeah.
I have a question. Can you say some words about Genesis 15:18?
You want to quote it to me?
Yeah, when God said to Abraham that the portion of the land that he would give to Israel, or to Abraham descendants. What do you say about that?
Okay, the verse is, on the same day, this is when God cut covenant.
And by the way, I'm from YWAM.
Oh, great. And my sister and brother-in-law with YWAM, and I have other sisters. Yeah.
And I'm pro Israel.
Yeah, and I'm not saying anything against YWAM. I'm just saying this YWAM girl who was put in that place, she had her mind poisoned. I wouldn't dream of saying anything against YWAM. The verse is, the context is the cutting of covenant. Abraham says, how will I know that I will inherit this land? And God says, now slaughter these animals and put them down on the ground. And then God puts Abraham to sleep. And God goes through the cut pieces on his own. And so God makes, so this isn't really a covenant with Abraham, this is a covenant God makes with himself. And in the next chapter, chapter 17, I've actually underlined the number of times God calls it my covenant, my covenant, my covenant, my covenant. He says it at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times. He calls it my covenant in the next chapter. And so at the end of that, then he said that the verse you're referring to, on that day, on the same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. That's the verse. What's the question?
So, that what we believe that God has given this land
Yes.
to Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's okay for people to disagree, but God said that's the land that He gave, that will be.
Yes, I agree. So you're just declaring your statement of faith. You believe it. Yeah, amen. I absolutely agree with you. Yes.
And actually, that points out that the land is far larger than what they currently.
Yeah, the borders of the land here.
Yeah.
The borders of the land here are from the river of Egypt, which is not the Nile River.
Right.
The river of Egypt is the Great Wadi. The river of Egypt. It's called the river of Egypt. It's at the southern end of the Gaza Strip. Okay, the Sinai Desert is not included. It's from there, goes all the way up to what was Phoenicia, which is a bit into southern Lebanon to the Litani River. And then it goes up across the Golan Heights, goes all the way up north of Damascus, all the way up to the Euphrates, a huge chunk of modern-day Syria, and it includes part of the current kingdom of Jordan as well. So it is a much larger piece of land than they have currently, but under Solomon, all of that land was part of his kingdom.
Yeah.
So my second question is, did God change?
That doesn't sound like a question. That's an affirmative statement. Did God change? No, he didn't, and of course he doesn't. And of course God wasn't taken by surprise in anything that has happened. He knows the beginning of all things from the end. So that's a given. He hasn't changed. And there's no such thing as the Old Testament either, by the way.
Yes, there you
There was no, God did not call it the Old Testament. That's not his name for the Bible.
Amen.
There's nothing old in it.
That's right.
None of the promises, none of the covenants. The Old Testament, not the Testament with Noah, not the Testament with Abraham, not the Testament with Sinai, not the Testament with David, and not Jeremiah 31:31. The New Covenant, they're all in the Old Testament, they're not old.
Amen.
Amen.
So stop calling it the Old Testament. We really should. You just say the word old and people think, oh, well, I've got the new. People think that the gospel begins with the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. But when Stephen's standing in front of the crowd and he's about to be stoned to death and he's going to testify, where does he begin his story? With Abraham. That's where he begins, and the promise of the land. And in Galatians chapter 3, Paul says, the scriptures told the gospel to Abraham when it said, leave your land and come to a land I will show you. So from God's point of view, the land issue has always been the beginning of the gospel story. He created a land, he created a stage. The stage is for the plan of redemption. It all plays out on that land up until Jesus and until Jesus comes again. And that brings me to the other main point I want to make tonight, which is really a minefield to walk into, and I only do it because I'm absolutely convicted that we as pro-Israel Christians are actually being misdirected in our understanding of what our calling is supposed to be in these days. And I'll clarify. This is not popular, but I'm going to say it anyway. The majority of Christians who believe that we should stand with Israel and that God has not finished with Israel in your country and in most of the West of Western Christianity, evangelical Christianity, believe that the time of Jacob's trouble is still coming. And they fit the times of Jacob's trouble into the end time scenario, which for some of them begins with a rapture, others have a rapture in the middle, others have a rapture at the end. I'm not talking about that for the moment. I'll speak to that in a moment if you want me to, but this component, this idea that the time of Jacob's trouble lies ahead. I have not read, now long ago stopped reading books on end-time prophecy because I felt compelled by God to stop reading books, and he said, go read my book, you don't need any other books. It's all in here. And the reason that I asked him, that I went to him, was because I was distressed I was distressed by the fact that in the Christchurch bookstore in the Old City, in the prophecy section, there are 100 different authors who have 100 different end-time scenarios, and they all believe completely that they're right. They're convinced of it. There are churches in this country, you cannot stand in the pulpit unless you sign on the dotted line that you believe in the pre-trib rapture of the church, for example. We can talk about the rapture if you like, at some point later, but this component of it, the time of Jacob's trouble, what does it hold? It holds that after the Jews return to their land, that they're going to face a massive slaughter. That 2/3 of them are going to be killed. All right. I'm willing to lay my life down on this one. It's not true. It's not biblical. It's not sound at all. And why? Because God has tied his reputation to another future for the Jewish people. I'll spell it out exactly as I read it in Scripture, beginning with Moses, and then through all the prophets, including Jeremiah 30, which speaks about Jacob's trouble specifically, and then all the way through to the words that God says in Isaiah and Jeremiah, the nations of the world need to be told. I can't unpack the whole thing. We don't have time, but most of this you already probably know. A fundamental principle. There's some fundamental principles in the Bible. One of them is that those who bless you I will bless, and he who curses you I will curse. We all know that one because we all want blessings, right? But there's another principle that he lays out with Moses, and that principle speaks to the blessings and the curses that come on the Jewish people. The curses that come on the Jews that lead to their suffering, warfare, destruction, and captivity, those curses are played out in the context of them being slowly and gradually uprooted from the land and finally expelled from the land. In the same sense, the return to the land of Israel, the coming back to the land, the re-establishment in the land as a nation, is tied to the blessings. There's a very, very clear distinction. Curses will end, culminate in, climax in your expulsion from the land. But that's where the curses take place. And when you're out there, then you will experience the curses. When you come back to the land, you come back for blessing. Now, when I say God's credibility is tied to this, do this study. Do this. I would encourage you to do this for your own sake. If you stand with Israel, because this is a big thing that not only that we have to combat, I believe, not only that we should have an understanding of, but we need to know that the Jewish people who are aware of Christian Zionist support for Israel, whether it's Kufi or all the others that are somewhat less significant perhaps, except for the ministries that are based in Jerusalem, Bridges for Peace, the Christian Embassy, Israeli Jews are aware that most pro-Israel Christians believe and teach that ultimately the church is going to be removed from the earth and the Jewish people are going to go through suffering under the Antichrist. And 2/3 are going to be wiped out. That's what mainstream pro-Israel Christianity teaches to a large extent. There are some who teach a slightly different version of that, but they all teach a separate destiny initially for Israel and for the church. Okay. As far as Israel is concerned, God said he will scatter them. And he said he would send a sword after them, and he would send a plague after them, and he would basically hunt them out and decimate their ranks. He said he would preserve a small remnant, but the rest of them would be washed away as a consequence of the unfaithfulness. Fact, 1500 years, for the first 1500 years after the expulsion of the Jewish people from Israel by the Romans, they never grew in number. If they did, I won't elaborate, but if they did, you can do the math later, if they did, there would be more Jews, if they had not been dispersed, there would be more Jews than Chinese people in the world today. No exaggeration. We can talk about that. If you want me to clarify, we can get there. But it's a fact. They only began to multiply in number after the Dark Ages. And they were beginning to grow large families and get established again as a nation in terms of numbers when the 1930s broke out and 1/3 of the Jews were washed away again. And they were cut down to just 2/3 left alive. So that after these 2,000 years of wandering, those that came back to the land were the remnant that survived. Jesus spoke to that long period of suffering. He called it the Great Tribulation. And he wasn't talking about the Great Tribulation at the end of days that we see in Revelation. The context is very, very clear Do I need to unpack this a little bit?
Yes.
Okay, let me unpack this, because normally I do this on the Mount of Olives. Jesus comes to Jerusalem to die. His disciples have expected that he will establish his kingdom then. He's already told them in a parable, no, I'm going away to a faraway land to get my kingdom and to return. I have not come to be king now. He comes down the mountain on the donkey. He looks over the city. His heart breaks. He begins to weep. He continues down the mountain, goes into the temple. The widow puts her 2 mites in the offering place. Jesus talks about that. He steps out of the temple, and his disciples say to him, wow, look at this amazing building. The temple is going to be under construction for nearly 100 years. From the time Herod begins to build it until Titus destroys it in AD 70. It's under construction all that time. It's a very, very beautiful building with accessories, etc. The disciples are impressed. Jesus is totally unimpressed. And he says to them, not one stone will be left upon another. He crosses the valley, goes up onto the mountain. 4 disciples come to talk to him. This is a private meeting. It's in the text. It's very important. 4 disciples come to him. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not among them. But those are the men that give us the account. Like journalists, they tell the story, but they're not there. And the question the 4 disciples ask Jesus is, well, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And beginning with the destruction of Jerusalem, Jesus lays out what will happen over the next 2,000 years. And it's specifically, in context, unless you're going to be dishonest with the context, it is specifically to do with the future of the Jewish people, not the future of the church. Not until the end, not when the sign of the Son of Man is seen in heavens and he comes on the clouds in glory, only then. But the whole history that he lays out has to do with what's coming on the Jewish people. And he bookends it. On the one end, he says it begins with destruction, with the laying waste, with the abomination of desolation. And if you want to know what that is, we'll talk about that later. But it begins with that, and it ends when Jerusalem is no longer trodden down by Gentiles. And in that period of time, Jesus says there will be such great tribulation as has not been until this time, the time of which he was speaking. And then he ascends to heaven, and a few years later, the crisis explodes. The rebellion breaks out, and the Sea of Galilee is choked with the bloated bodies, corpses of Jews, and the Mediterranean is red with their blood, and the Jews are massively destroyed. They first destroy each other in terrible civil strife, and then the Romans finish the job and take those that survive, take them out of the land. Between AD 70 and AD 135, 2/3 of the Jewish people are killed. The other third go into captivity. That great tribulation that Jesus was speaking about in Matthew 24, that speaks to the future of the Jewish people. It begins with the destruction of Jerusalem. It ends when Jerusalem is no longer trodden down by Gentiles. It's in that period of time. And that is history. It's documented, recorded history. For 2,000 years, this is what they experienced. Their diaspora began with the Holocaust, with a genocidal war, and it ended with another one. And it is out of the destruction of the Holocaust of World War II that Israel is reborn. And now you go to the passage in Jeremiah 30, where he talks about a time of Jacob's trouble. You can go and read it. It's a very graphic illustration of what it was, I guess, what it was like as put to the prophet. But out of that, they are saved, and out of that, they are returned to their land. And one more passage back, and there's more than one, but one more passage backs this up, and I'm going to read this one. It's Psalm 102. Psalm 102. Every now and then you get a gem of an idea, or somebody shares something that really changes the way you approach Bible study. And I want to just drop a thought into your head for the future. Just quick. The Bible was written primarily by Israelites for Israelites, okay? The book of Psalms was written by Jews. And when it says, it talks about us and we and our, it's not talking about the church. When it talks about saints, it's not talking about the church. It's talking about Israel and the Jewish people. First and foremost. Afterwards, we can apply it to ourselves if we like, all the promises to the fathers, etc. But when you read the Psalms, I'm finding it fascinating. When you go and read the Psalms, and every time it says us and our and we, in appeal to God, they're talking about Israel as a nation. It's fabulous. It's amazing. And that's obviously the case in Psalm 102, which we don't know the author of. Hear my prayer, O Lord, and let my cry come to you. Do not hide your face from me in the day of my trouble. Incline your ear to me in the day that I call. Answer me speedily. Now listen to this description. from verse 3. For my days are consumed like smoke, and my bones are burned like a hearth. My heart is stricken and withered like grass, so that I forget to eat my bread. Because of the sound of my groaning, my bones cling to my skin. I am like a pelican of the wilderness. I am like an owl of the desert. I lie awake and am like a sparrow alone on the housetop. My enemies reproach me all day long. Those who deride me swear an oath against me. For I have eaten ashes like bread and mingled my drink with weeping, because of your indignation and your wrath. For you have lifted me up and you have cast me away. My days are like a shadow that lengthens, and I wither away like grass. And then the next verse. But you, O Lord, shall endure forever, and the remembrance of your name to all generations. You will arise and have mercy on Zion, for the time to favor her, yes, the set time has come. When God talks about returning the people to the land of Israel, he uses, and again from Moses all the way through, he uses very positive words. He promises a very positive succession of events. He says, I will reach out my hand a second time, and I will gather you from all the nations where I have scattered you, and I will bring you back to the land I have given you. And I will plant you in that land with all of my heart and with all of my soul. And I will rejoice over you to do you good. I will dance over you. I will rejoice over you with singing. I will quieten you with my love. I will not stop doing you good. Declare it in the nations and tell it in the isles afar off, and say that he who scattered Israel will gather her and will keep her as a shepherd keeps his sheep.
Oh my goodness.
Time and time and time and time again. God says the day is coming, after all your suffering, when with tender cords of love I will draw you back to myself. I will bring you back in your sinful state. This is important to remember. I will bring you back with your uncircumcised hearts. I will bring you back to the land, and I will restore you to myself in the land. Now, God knows everything. And he's put a promise in his word, an encouraging promise to a future generation of Jewish people who have suffered terribly. And he has promised them that one day he's going to gather them and bring them back to their land, and he's going to take good care of them here. And nowhere does he suggest that in the back of his mind he's thinking, well, once I've encouraged you to come home and promised that I will take care of you as a shepherd, and I will look after you and rejoice over you after I've done all these things, that 2/3 of you are actually going to be swept away in another Holocaust. Nowhere does he hint at that. Nowhere does he suggest that at all. In fact, time and time again, he makes it very clear that when he's gathered them back to the land, he's going to stand up and fight for them and protect them.
Yeah.
2,000 years ago, Jesus wept because he couldn't gather them under his wings.
Wow.
He said, I wanted to. I wanted to gather you under my wings like a hen gathers her chicks. When Ruth comes to Israel, follows Naomi to Israel, and Boaz learns about her, Boaz says to her, you have come to take shelter under the wings of the Lord God of Israel.
Oh,
Wow.
Today,
Jesus.
this despised, hated, lonely, battered nation
Yes.
has been drawn back by God to his land, to be nestled under his wings and to be protected. The land of Israel is an ark, a place of safety. It's a fold, a sheepfold for the Jewish people.
Yes.
It is not, as the Muslims teach. From Baghdad to Lebanon to Cairo, they say, Allah has brought the Jewish people back from the four corners of the earth to their great graveyard. That's what the enemy is teaching. And too many Christian teachers are going along with that idea, that the Jews have come back.